political patterns and processes. So as you know, this unit is all about what makes a country, or in this case, a state, a state. It's going to be all about borders and things like that. It's going to be all about sovereignty and autonomy and why people have the rights that they have or don't have the rights that they don't have within a country. First thing to talk about is a sovereign state. A sovereign state is a state that is recognized internationally as being its own unit with defined boundaries that has its own control in government. A great example of that would be the United States. We are a sovereign state or country. Then you've got semi-autonomous regions. That's a region that is typically of one nationality or ethnicity that is given additional control over part of a country, kind of like Native Americans in this case. They have a lot of autonomy over their own land and their own tribes. Other examples would be the French in Canada. They are semi-autonomous in the Quebec region, Catalonians in Spain. But then some examples of sovereign states that are actually in question would be the Kurds in Kurdistan, which is not actually a place. It is the Kurds are spread out among about 4 Middle Eastern countries. Then you've got Catalonia in Spain, which some people think should be its own country. Taiwan, which is massively controversial as a country between Taiwan and China. And then you've got the division in the problems between Israel and Palestine and some questions over who there should have sovereignty. A couple of important definitions here. You've got nations. That's one group of people unified by culture, history, and usually attached to a homeland. Then you've got a nation state, a state typically composed of only one nation. A great example of that would be Japan. Japan, typically people there are ethnically Japanese, and they live in Japan where their ancestors are from. Then you've got the state, which is a country. Remember, the technical name for a country is a state. Group of people with a sovereign government with boundaries recognized internationally. So the only one there that might be a little bit confusing would be a nation. A nation is not exactly the same as a country. In general, a nation is a group of people who have certain things in common. A great example of a nation would be a group of Native Americans, like Cherokee Nation. Are they their own country? No, but they are semi-autonomous and they have so much in common. They're typically one ethnic group of people. Another example of a nation would be the Kurds, who, while not having their own state, they are still a nation because they are a unified ethnic group of people. Then you've got stateless nations, which would be an example of Kurds. Nationalities that don't have sovereignty or control over their homeland. Palestinians would be an example of this. Basques would be an example, and Catalonians in Italy. Multi-state nation is a nation that is spread across adjacent borders that are close to each other here, like Hungarians, Koreans, and Arabs. So as far as political processes, you have sovereignty. This is an important term. This is the political authority of a state or country to govern itself, and your sovereignty has to be recognized by other countries. Then you've got self-determination. That's a concept that ethnicities have the right to govern themselves based on self-identification. What is your ethnicity, and the idea that your ethnicity should have the right to do what's best for your ethnicity. And so much of the divides that we have now are based on colonialism and imperialism. So colonialism is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers. For example, what Britain did with North America. Britain sent over colonists, and eventually they grew into North America. Then you've got imperialism, a policy of extending a country's power and influence through diplomacy or military force, typically done by means of extracting resources and controlling the locals. You typically, in imperialism, aren't sending people to live there. You are exerting your influence there through diplomacy or through the use of force. Then you've got neo-colonialism, which is the use of economic, political, or other pressures to control or influence other countries. And remember that all of this kind of comes to a head in the Cold War, which is the long unfought war between the United States and the Soviet Union after World War II. The Soviet Union was a communist state in which all assets are controlled by the government and distributed equally to the people. As America is looking at this from the late 40s into the early 1990s, we are worried that the other states around the Soviet Union are going to become communist as well. And that's because the Soviet Union had been doing this. They had been acquiring Eastern European states. They're called the Soviet Union and not Russia for a reason, because the Soviet Union is made up of satellite states, little countries in that area like the Ukraine and Georgia, the country. And we're worried that Russia, the Soviet Union, is going to continue to take communist countries, and one by one, they're going to fall like dominoes. While this is sometimes portrayed as crazy in the United States being a little bit paranoid, it's actually not that crazy because in the late 1940s, China, the biggest country as far as population in the world, goes communist. And under a communist revolution by a guy named Mao Zedong. And then after that, in 1950, you see Korea go communist. Now, Korea is going to be artificially split before this time, after World War II, by outside powers. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. And Korea is going to become North Korea, which is going to be communist, and North Korea, which is communist, and then South Korea, which is going to be capitalist. In 1950, North Korea invades South Korea, trying to make South Korea communist. This is why we're going to fight with the United Nations, the Korean War. That's going to end in a stalemate, a tie in 1953, with the boundaries staying how they are, North Korea and South Korea. So you see here, that's the domino theory, that if one little country falls to communism, all the other countries will fall too. That's the reason for America's involvement in the Vietnam War. But then in our policy of going and fighting against communism and keeping it where it is called containment. Keep communism where it is. So to kind of come back from that little history lesson, remember that political power is expressed as control over people, land, resources, and it's seen in shatter belts. That's a region caught between strong colliding cultural and political forces, kind of like the way that North Korea and South Korea got caught between the Soviet Union and the United States, or Eastern Europe and Western Europe as they fought against Russian forces. And then it's also choke points, a geographical feature such as a valley, bridge, or strait, which is a critical point for either trade or combat. A great example of this would be the Strait of Malacca, or more importantly, the Panama Canal. Remember that territoriality is the connection of people, their culture, and their economic systems to the land. Now, for political boundaries, we have a few to remember here. You have antecedent, which is a line that is drawn before the cultural landscape develops, like the Canada-U.S. border. The Canada-U.S. border was already drawn as America spreads west, then consequent borders. Boundary that matches a cultural divide, like the creation of Muslim Pakistan and Bangladesh from Hindu India. Then you've got geometric borders, a straight line that is unrelated to physical or cultural differences. Then you've got relic borders, boundaries that can still be seen even after the political boundaries have changed. An example of this would be these old Soviet states that don't really exist anymore, or something like the Berlin Wall that after World War II splits Berlin in half. People couldn't cross it, but now it's been knocked down. You can still see remnants of it. That would be a relic boundary. You've got subsequent. These are boundaries that develop with the cultural landscape. An example would be the states of the United States as America expands west, the states form. Then you've got superimposed boundaries. These superimposed boundaries are put there by other people. An example of this would be that border that we put between North and South Korea, or it could be Native American reservations. It could be African countries in the scramble for Africa as European countries in the late 1800s are chopping up pieces of Africa and taking them for their colonial interests. Those borders tend to have been drawn by colonial powers. So the way that you create one of these political boundaries, first you have to define it. You have to create a legal treaty saying my land starts here, your land starts there. Then you have to delimit it. You need to draw that line on a map. Then you need to demarcate it, put up some sort of physical boundary or marker. This can be as simple as a picket fence or a roll of paper that blocks and says, this is my spot, that is your spot. And then you need to administer it. Government entities regularly monitor and maintain that border. That's how you create a boundary. Now, a couple of important things about the law of the sea. The United Nations, which is a supranational organization, which meaning that it is above individual countries and is able to somewhat tell individual countries what to do. The law of the sea defines the rights and responsibilities of nations in the use of international waters, established territorial seas, and also in exclusive economic zones. Internal boundaries, and this is where we get into some really, really political stuff. First off, you've got voting districts, how voters are divided up to participate in elections and elect local officials. And then you've got redistricting, the process of drawing electoral district boundaries in the United States. And then you've got the big one, gerrymandering. And you might remember this because we had a character in our game named Gerrymander who wanted to redraw the political map. Gerrymandering is a practice intended to establish a political advantage for a particular party or group by manipulating district boundaries. Essentially, if more of your people live in one area, you want to draw the boundary so that it is closer to them, and therefore you get more votes. So forms of governance, you've got unitary, where power is in a central government usually led by one person. This is how it is in Western Europe, China, and Iran. And then you've got federal, where power is distributed along a hierarchy of local and national control, counties, states like that, working your way up to the bigger power. That would be the United States, Mexico, Russia, and Nigeria. Now, an important word to define really quick as we go through this really fast is devolution. That's the transfer of power from national government to local governments, as essentially they say you can basically do this better, being closer to where you are. The big government is taking a step back, and the small government is getting a little bit more power. Now, this devolution can be caused by quite a few things. It can be caused by physical geography. Hey, we're super far from you, and thus we think you'll do a better job doing it, local government. Or it can be because of ethnic reasons, ethnic separatism. It can be, in a lot of bad ways, ethnic cleansing or terrorism that causes the government's relationship to a certain area to devolve. It could be economic and social problems, or it could be irredentism. Irredentism is a policy of advocating the restoration to a country of any territory formerly belonging to it. And that's a great example of why sometimes you see Native Americans on certain land. Or Israel after World War II. The Jewish people get that land back, or get some land, a permanent place for them to live because of the fact that they were a stateless nation. Or Nazi Germany giving back claims on Czechoslovakia. Now, anytime that you get into these sort of ethnic cleansing, ethnic problems, you always are going to deal with things like genocide. That's a desire and attempt at complete extermination of an ethnicity. Examples obviously would be the Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide between the Hutus and the Tutsi, and then Myanmar, which is the Burmese and the Rohingya. And this sort of thing always seems to be happening in the world, where one group wants to eliminate another group. Now, supranationalism, I've already defined this, but I'll talk about it again real quick. This is when countries give up portions of their power to join an international organization, such as the United Nations, the European Union, things like that. Basically saying that I will give up, as my country, a little bit of my freedom so that a group of countries can watch over what we are doing as countries. And then the last thing that I'll talk about real quick is centripetal versus centrifugal forces. Remember that centripetal forces are forces that unite people, and centrifugal forces are forces that divide people. Some centripetal forces that are uniting people would be a strong national identity, infrastructure development that is more equal for people. And then ethno-nationalism, basically where people are very proud of where they come from. Also, if they have the same language and religion. Now, centrifugal forces, that could be armed. These are things that pull people apart. These centrifugal forces can be things like majority versus minority armed conflicts, balkanization when one state breaks down into multiple states, or it can be uneven development where one part of the country is doing much better than another part of the country. That can drive the country apart. But it can also be if you've got a stateless nation within your country that is kind of causing issues, they're not very happy about the fact that they're part of your country, and ethnic movements. So I know we went through it fast, but this has been your political patterns and processes lesson.